By the end of the 1980s, the Lviv Bus Plant was one of the largest bus manufacturers in the world. In its best years, it produced nearly 15,000 vehicles annually, and Laz buses operated across the Soviet Union and far beyond its borders. A few decades later, almost nothing remained of this industrial giant, but abandoned workshops and a largely deserted factory site. At first glance, the explanation seems obvious. The Soviet Union collapsed, the old market disappeared, state funding dried up, and an aging factory failed to survive the new conditions. But the story of the Lviv Bus Plant was more complicated than that. The factory did try to move forward. It developed new models, tried to reach European standards, and continued to believe that a real bus should remain a full-size, purpose-built bus. And ironically, that very desire to build buses better than the new market actually demanded eventually became one of the reasons the Lviv Bus Plant was brought down. But first, we need to go back to the beginning. The history of the Lviv Bus Plant began before the first bus was ever built there. In 1945, shortly after the end of the war, construction began on a new vehicle assembly plant in Lviv. The country urgently needed almost everything. So during its first years, the factory produced a wide range of equipment, including trailers, truck-mounted cranes, mobile shops, and even a small batch of electric delivery vans for postal service in the early 1950s. By the middle of the 1950s, the plant was redirected toward bus production, which the country needed in enormous numbers. The original plan was to transfer production of the already established ZIS 155 to Lviv, together with the necessary documentation. It was the simplest solution. The bus was already in series production, its design was proven, and all that remained was to set up production at the new plant. But Viktor Osipchugov, who had been appointed chief designer of Laz in 1952, rejected that idea. He believed the ZIS 155 was already becoming outdated, and that there was little point in developing the design any further. That judgment may have been somewhat harsh for the middle of the 1950s. But overall, Osipchugov was right. The ZIS 155 had been created as a compromise and essentially a transitional model. After the complex and expensive ZIS 154, the country needed a simpler bus that could be put into mass production quickly while a more modern replacement was being prepared. Still, the ZIS 155 was not a primitive machine. It had an all-metal load-bearing body with extensive use of aluminum alloys, and, by late 1940 standards, was a perfectly modern, mass-produced bus. But by the middle of the 1950s, its layout was already falling noticeably behind European designs. The front-mounted engine took up valuable interior space and made conditions worse for the driver. The bus had high entrance steps, and heat, noise, and exhaust fumes around the driver's position were common problems. Production of the ZIS 155 was also already approaching its end. So Osipchugov pushed for a different solution. Instead of transferring an aging design to Lviv, he wanted to create an entirely new bus from the beginning, with enough potential for further development. He managed to defend that idea, and in 1955, work began on the first bus designed by Laz itself. Designing a modern bus from scratch was much harder than simply making that decision. The young factory had almost no experience of its own, so several modern West German buses were brought to Lviv, including models from Mercedes-Benz and Majiris. They were studied carefully, but the future Laz was not a direct copy of any one vehicle. The European buses served mainly as reference points. Development moved very quickly. Design work began in the second half of 1955, and by February 1956, the first prototype had already been completed. It received the designation Laz 695. The biggest difference from the ZIS 155 was the basic layout. The engine was moved to the rear, freeing up space at the front and significantly improving conditions for the driver. The bus used a lightweight, welded structural base supporting the body. It also received an unusual suspension, combining leaf springs with additional correcting coil springs, which helped maintain a relatively smooth ride under different loads. The new bus also looked completely different from typical Soviet vehicles of the time. Its large glass area, distinctive windows along the roof edges, and lighter proportions made it look much closer to contemporary Western European buses than to the ZIS 155. It was impossible to avoid existing components entirely. The engine, gearbox, axles, and several other parts had to come from production Z's and ZIL trucks. So beneath the modern body was fairly conventional Soviet mechanical hardware, and the 109 horsepower engine gave the nearly 9-meter bus only modest performance. Even so, the new bus made a strong impression, and it did not remain a prototype for long. In 1957, a large batch of early Laz 695s was sent to Moscow, where they served during the 6th World Festival of Youth and Students. For such a young factory, this was serious recognition. Its new bus was among the vehicles used by the Soviet Union to welcome tens of thousands of foreign visitors. The first years of operation revealed plenty of problems. The buses suffered from poor heating and ventilation. The engine intake drew in road dust, and some components were difficult to service. But there was no fundamental flaw in the overall design, so most of these problems were gradually corrected. From there, Laz followed a path of constantly improving the same basic design. One especially important step was the introduction of a version with the 150 horsepower ZIL 130 engine. The previous engine had been clearly underpowered for such a large bus, while the new V8 noticeably improved performance. Over time, it became clear that Laz had found a very successful niche. Its interior was not ideal for the busiest routes in major cities. There were plenty of seats, but relatively little room for standing passengers, and almost no large standing areas near the doors. On suburban routes between smaller towns, in company fleets, and on less crowded services, however, the bus was almost ideal. And the Soviet Union had tens of thousands of routes like these. Demand kept growing, while the factory continued improving the same successful platform without disrupting an already established production system. Engines, bodywork, brakes, doors, and styling changed, but the basic design remained the same. By the middle of the 1970s, the Laz 695N had appeared, the version that for many people became the classic Laz. It remained in production for decades, and total production of the 695 family eventually reached around 250,000 vehicles. As a result, the Laz 695 became the most widely produced bus in history. But Laz was more than just a giant factory producing 695s. Lviv gradually became one of the main centers of bus engineering in the Soviet Union. In the early 1960s, the factory developed the Ukraina series of touring coaches with air suspension, power steering, and more comfortable interiors. Later, buses from Lviv won awards at international competitions, and by the end of the decade, the factory had built experimental low-floor buses with a floor height of only around 360 millimeters. In 1965, the Laz design department was separated into an independent central bus design bureau. 10 years later, it became the Soviet Union's main research and development institute for bus design. It worked on new models not only for Laz, but also for other manufacturers across the country. And this was where a problem began to appear that would later become especially painful for Laz. Designing a modern bus was much easier than getting it into full-scale production. A good example was the Laz 4202, developed as a replacement for the old 695. It had a completely new angular body, a diesel engine, an automatic transmission, and an interior better suited to city service. Production officially began in the late 1970s, but instead of thousands of buses, the factory built only a handful. Problems with the body, transmission, and other components forced repeated redesigns. As a result, the old Laz 695 continued to roll off the production line in huge numbers, while its far more modern successor spent years struggling to reach true mass production. Even so, by the end of the 1980s, Laz was at the peak of its capabilities. In 1988, the factory produced a record 14,646 buses and was already working on the next generation, the Laz 4206 and the inner-city Laz 4207. So by the end of the Soviet era, Laz could hardly be described as an outdated factory that had simply spent decades building the same bus. It was a huge industrial enterprise with a strong engineering school and was already preparing to move to an entirely new generation of buses. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Laz continued for a while on the momentum of a huge Soviet industrial enterprise. In 1990, the factory produced 12,118 buses. In 1991, it still built 11,793. But then the centralized purchasing system disappeared, the old supply network collapsed, and state-owned bus fleets in Ukraine and other former Soviet republics, traditionally the main customers for Laz, were left with almost no money to replace their vehicles on a large scale. Passenger transport itself also changed. In the Soviet Union, public transport was not expected to make a profit. Fares were extremely cheap, many groups of passengers received discounts or traveled free, and operating losses were covered by the state. The main goal was simply to move huge numbers of people. After the transition to a market economy, profitability became far more important, and vehicles designed for a completely different system were not always well suited to the new reality. In many cities, large buses began losing ground to minibuses, including vehicles converted from cargo vans. They became commonly known as marshrutkas, privately operated minibuses running along fixed routes. They were much cheaper than a full-size bus, used less fuel, required fewer staff, and allowed a private operator to start a business with far less money. With weak regulation during the 1990s, this quickly turned into chaos. Dozens of private operators competed for the most profitable routes and passengers, while carrying capacity became less important than making money. The market gradually became more organized, but the basic principle remained the same. A private operator still wanted a small, cheap, and simple bus. Some of the first to understand this were not at Laz. In 1995, the Chasiv Yar repair plant began producing small buses on Gazelle chassis, later sold under the Ruta brand. In 1998, the new owner of the Cherkasy vehicle repair plant, which had repaired buses during the Soviet period, commissioned the Lviv Bus Institute to develop a small city bus using Isuzu NQR components. The result appeared the following year as the Bogdan A091. It occupied the space between a typical marshtrutka and a traditional full-size bus. It had around 20 seats, a total capacity of roughly 45 passengers, 2 passenger doors, and an economical diesel engine. There was little emphasis on comfort. This was a deliberately simple bus, designed above all for low operating costs and a quick return on investment. In 1999, only a handful were built. Just a few years later, the Cherkasy plant was producing more than 1,000 a year. The Bogdan was exactly the right vehicle at the right time. Competitors soon followed. In 2002, the Borispil automobile plant began producing the Etalon A079 on an Indian Tata truck chassis. A year later, companies from the same group introduced the even smaller Baz 2215 Delphin, based on the Gazelle chassis. Like the Bogdan, both vehicles were developed with the involvement of the Lviv Institute. There were also dozens of smaller manufacturers and conversion companies. Some used Gazelles, while others relied on Russian or imported truck chassis. But the basic idea was always the same: build the simplest and cheapest vehicle possible, one that a private operator could afford and put into service quickly. Demand for vehicles like these was enormous, but Laz chose to stay almost entirely out of this competition. Despite all the difficulties of the 1990s, the Lviv Bus Plant still saw itself as a manufacturer of real buses. Both among the public and within the industry, Bogdans and marshrutkas were often treated with a certain degree of contempt. Many people saw them as cheap substitutes for proper buses, and Laz management appears to have shared much the same view. Later, this position became completely open. In 2005, Ihor Churkin said directly that Laz had traditionally produced expensive, large, and extra-large buses, and had no intention of changing that direction. This position did not change even when it became obvious that vehicles like the Bogdan were taking over the market at an extraordinary pace. Laz deliberately chose the opposite path: large, expensive, modern buses. At first glance, this can look almost stubborn to the point of self-destruction. But the logic was roughly this: the crisis would eventually end. Cities would once again need proper full-size buses, and the factory and its workforce had to survive long enough to offer a modern replacement for old Soviet vehicles. But not at the cost of turning a huge bus manufacturer into an assembly plant for the very same half buses that Laz clearly looked down on. For a while, the factory continued producing the Laz 695, though demand was now much lower, and most examples went to provincial routes or were used as company transport. But the main new direction was the large city bus, the Laz 5252. The project itself had started during the Soviet period, but after 1991 it became especially important. Deliveries of Hungarian Icarus buses fell sharply, while Ukraine needed its own bus capable of carrying roughly 80 to 100 passengers. In January 1994, the Cabinet of Ministers specifically ordered the launch of large city buses from this family. Work also continued on the intercity Laz 4207, another project that had begun before the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of these projects faced one major problem. The collapse of the Soviet Union destroyed not only the old market, but also the supply chains for engines, axles, gearboxes, and other components. The older Laz family depended heavily on ZIL parts, while the newer models relied on KAMAZ and other factories that had once been part of a single Soviet industrial system. Now they were across an international border with customs and separate economies. As a result, new Laz buses constantly had to be adapted to whatever components were available. The same model could be fitted at different times with Renault, Raba, Yams, Cummins, and other engines, while axles and gearboxes also changed. Laz also tried to develop trolley buses, but without much success. The bus business was only slightly better. During the first half of the decade, major cities still ordered noticeable batches, but overall demand kept falling. By the end of the 1990s, annual production had collapsed from almost 12,000 vehicles to only a few hundred. For a factory that had recently been building dozens of buses every day, this was catastrophic. Without going too deeply into the economics of individual models or the quality of management, one of Laz's biggest mistakes can be described in a surprisingly simple way. The factory was not wrong to believe that the crisis of the 1990s would eventually end. The economy did gradually stabilize. More money became available, and cities once again had the ability to renew their public transport fleets. Laz was wrong about something else. Its management seems to have viewed marshrutkas as a temporary product of the crisis that would disappear once the crisis was over. But they did not. Marshutkas turned out to be far too convenient for both private operators and local governments. Cities no longer had to find the money to buy hundreds of expensive buses or maintain huge municipal transport companies. A private operator bought the vehicle, hired the driver, and earned money directly from passengers. Weak regulation, corruption in the allocation of routes, and the interests of the operators themselves only reinforced this system. So the crisis ended, but large buses never returned on anything close to the same scale. Even so, in 1998, when the factory situation had become especially serious, Laz did make an attempt to enter the small bus market. The result was the Laz A073, just 6.84 meters long and based on components from the ZIL 5301 Bychok. It could carry around 40 passengers, including 24 seated, and was essentially Laz's direct attempt to enter the class that would soon be dominated by Bogdan and Etalon. The experiment did not last long. Only 17 were built in 1998 and 1999 before the project was abandoned. In the early 2000s, Laz finally had a chance to prove that its focus on large buses had been the right choice after all. In 2001, the state sold a controlling stake in the company to a private investor, and the factory began updating its model range quickly. Old Soviet designs gradually disappeared, while Laz moved toward buses that were much closer to contemporary European standards. In 2003, the touring NeoLaz appeared, followed a year later by the CityLaz A183. This was a completely different kind of bus, 12 meters long, fully low floor, with wide doors, air suspension, wheelchair access, modern diesel engines, and automatic transmissions. Later came the ElectroLaz trolleybus and an articulated CityLaz. At first, the strategy seemed to be working. In 2002, the factory produced just over 300 buses. By 2004, output had risen to more than 700. Kyiv ordered a large batch of CityLaz buses, other cities began buying them as well, and export deliveries appeared. But the main weakness of this strategy soon became obvious. A Bogdan or an Etalon could be sold in small batches to hundreds of private operators. Large Laz buses were bought mainly by cities and municipal transport companies. So instead of thousands of small customers, the factory depended on a handful of major tenders. When there was an order, production kept moving. When there was no order or a city delayed payment, the entire factory could run out of money almost immediately. For a while, the system still worked. In 2007, Laz sold around 750 vehicles. But even then, management admitted that roughly 600 vehicles a year was almost the minimum volume needed for a factory of that size to operate normally. And just as things seemed to be improving, 2008 arrived. Laz had barely recovered from the previous crisis before it was hit by another one, this time global. Municipal purchases almost stopped. Cities stopped paying for new buses, production collapsed, and serious wage debts appeared. Over the entire year, the factory produced only around 70 vehicles. But this was still not the end. Ukraine was preparing to host Euro 2012, and in the spring of 2010, a procurement program was announced for the host cities to buy 1,500 Laz buses and 500 Laz trolley buses. For a factory that had recently been close to shutting down, this was almost the perfect order. It could do more than simply save the plant. It could return production to normal levels. But the original plan was never fully carried out. Instead of nearly 2,000 vehicles, the cities received only a few hundred. Municipalities lacked money, payments were delayed, and disputes and lawsuits began between customers and the factory. By that point, Laz itself was also dealing with too many problems: debts, unpaid wages, idle production capacity, and constant conflicts between the owners, workers, and authorities. After Euro 2012, the large orders disappeared again, and the factory quickly began sliding back into crisis. The workforce was reduced, production repeatedly stopped, and in 2013, the remaining employees were sent on unpaid leave. There were plans to move part of the production to another facility and leave only a few models in Lviv. In practical terms, this was already the end of Laz as a major manufacturer. Production at the old site soon stopped completely. Equipment began to be sold off, and the enormous factory grounds gradually turned into an abandoned industrial zone. This is how the story of one of the world's largest bus manufacturers came to an end. Even today, Ukrainians continue to argue over whether Laz chose the right strategy and whether the authorities and the company's owners did everything they could to save the plant. There is also a much harsher version of the story. Because the company was owned by Russian businessmen, some believe Laz was deliberately driven into decline while its most valuable assets were gradually removed. Later criminal cases involving the factory's property only strengthened those suspicions, although there is no proof that destroying the company was the owner's original goal. Whatever the truth, the Lviv Bus Plant disappeared as a major industrial enterprise. But for generations of Ukrainians, it remains a source of national pride. The story of how engineers in Lviv once convinced their superiors in Moscow to let them develop their own bus, instead of accepting a model imposed from above, is still retold on forums today. And over the decades, it has accumulated plenty of myths and different versions. The present condition of the factory is much harder to look back on. It is difficult to see anything in it except bitterness.